job, do you have the means by which to feed your family? No, you do not. No job equals no money. So you have no money. Is somebody just going to up and buy the food for you and your family? No, they are not. Second problem, if you're an immigrant. When you get off the boat, the politicians are going to woo you so that they can get your vote. But where are the immigrants forced to live?
Tenants.
Tenements. What else?
Unless you own your own home.
They live in tenements. What else do they live in? What else would they live in if they can't afford one of those? Have you ever heard of this word?
Shantytown.
Right, they would have shanty towns. You may also have something called a factory village. Where the company provides housing, but you may have to share a home with 2 or 3 families. You figure an average of 8 people per family in a house that's not as big as this. Yeah. So, if you're an immigrant, you have no job security. If you have no job security, you can't work. You have no money. You live in tenements, shanty towns, or in factory villages. With coal miners, they lived in coal mining towns. Coal or mining towns. Anybody ever see Coal Miner's Daughter? It's Loretta Lynn's story. What did her dad say the day that he got paid? Let's go give the company its what? Money back. If you lived here, you owed your soul to the company store. It's Tennessee Ernie Ford song. It's really cool. So, you had to live here. Another thing, if you're an immigrant worker, the money you do make, because you're facing all kinds of different fines and things like that, you're going to end up owing the company money. And while you owe that money to that company, you can't move. You can't leave. If you do, they can have you thrown in debtor's prison and make you work for free until you've paid off this money that you owe them. Okay, you're an immigrant and you have a bunch of little kids. What's going to happen to your kids while you're at work? Are you going to have to pay somebody to watch them? You have to provide your own child care. You might have 3 or 4 little ones. You still have to work. You have to pay somebody to watch your children. So where's your money going? Going to pay the babysitter. Is it going to help the family? No, it's not. So far, just by looking at this, would you want to be an immigrant? All right, let's talk about slaves. I do not condone slavery. Please do not believe this. But I do know that there are benefits to being a slave as opposed to being an immigrant worker. Okay. Where's everybody, we've talked about there are different slave codes for the slaves in different areas. Louisiana would be one of the first places to have these. Every code was different, but I'm going to share with you some of the ones from Louisiana. Some of these are crazy. They can't play drums or horns. If you're a slave, you can't do this. They must step aside when a white person walks by. They cannot sue or be sued or be in a jury or anything like that. They can't learn to read or write, even though this rule is broken. Their marriages aren't recognized as legal. Now you got to look at it this way: is that a blessing or is that a punishment? What if they get a dud? So, well, I'm not married to her anyway. I'll just sell me to this guy and I'll get me a new wife. So yeah, I mean, you got to look at that one for what it is. They can't gamble. They can't trade with white people, or with free blacks, or with other slaves. They cannot own a gun. Why not? Duh. Even though they were sent out to do the hunting a lot of the time. They can be sold at any time and they can't do anything about it. Like a cow can't sue for being sold to the slaughterhouse. Okay, sort of something like that. Their slaves aren't allowed to leave the plantation without a pass from whoever's in charge. This does happen. They do get to go different places. And what's ironic is 99 times out of 100, they don't even try to run away. Which, I mean, think about it. If you were allegedly in this miserable condition known as slavery, and you had a pass to go to town to pick up supplies for the plantation, and you had a buggy and a horse and some money in your pocket, where would you go? Oh, they went to the store and they came back. So could it have been that horrible? I mean, yeah, there were masters that were horrible. Slavery is not right. Please do not think I believe that, because it is not. I do not agree with it. But you have ample opportunity to escape it, yet you don't escape. Maybe because you've heard nightmare stories about what's going on up north in the factories. So think about it. You have different kinds of management on the plantation. You have, of course, the owner, which is the master of the plantation. You have an overseer that would be the liaison between the slaves and the master. The overseer would go see the master, get a list of what had to be done, and a good overseer didn't even need this. And then he would go to the next group, the slave drivers, and pass on the information from there. Now, the overseer job was not just sitting on a horse, cracking a whip at people, and making them work. You couldn't get away with being an overseer just by doing that. You had to know how to do certain things. You have to know something about agriculture. You have to know how to grow things, when to plant them, what kind of nutrients they need, things like that. You have to know how to read and write. That's a rarity in the South because they didn't stress a really strong education system. You have to know how to plant things. A lot of times the overseers will rely on the slaves because they know more about that. You have to know how to cultivate and how to harvest. There's a certain way to harvest tobacco. There's a certain way to harvest rice. There's a certain way to harvest cotton. You have to know how to do this in order to be a good overseer. You have to know about each crop that you're putting out. You have to be an expert at labor relations. If you have a bunch of people working for you, if you want them to work hard, are you going to treat them like garbage? No, you're not, because your success is what they're dependent on for survival. A plantation that makes no money, the slaves are going to starve to death or be sold off. You have to be able to be diplomatic. You have to be able to talk to the master. You have to be able to deal with the slaves, the slave drivers, other overseers. Basically, your management. Plus, you don't want to overwork your slaves. there's this idea that all slaves were worked until they collapsed at the end of the day. No, this is not true. They would work usually from like 5 o'clock in the morning until around 11, at which time they would get a 3-hour break during the hottest part of the day. They would go back to work at 2 and work till about 6, 7 o'clock at night. And then they would go back to their cabins and the rest of the time was theirs. They got holidays off. They didn't work in the fields on Sunday. They did the normal chores like anybody would, but they didn't work on Sundays. And if they did, they got paid for it. So it wasn't like everybody paints it to be. Yes, there are exceptions to that, but those are exceptions and not the overall rule. Now, the next person down on the chain of command is the slave driver. It's usually a slave that has been there a while, an older slave that knows how the plantation works. And he's going to be put in charge of different gangs of slaves. And he will talk with them because they're going to listen to him quicker than they will the white overseer, even though some of the overseers were black, believe it or not. So they will deal directly with the slaves, and they'll say, here's what needs to be done. And usually, the slave driver, if he's a good slave driver, will know what has to be done. They've set down a schedule. Everything is done like this. It all has to work together. The slave drivers will have a little bit bigger house. They'll get extra privileges, extra food, things like that. And he's usually the go-between between the master and the overseer. He could report directly to the master of the house and say, look, this overseer is overworking these people. For example, pregnant women. Just because a slave was pregnant didn't mean she didn't have to work if she was a field hand. However, there were special conditions that they had to observe for her. Like she had to be able to, she could only work like 8 hours a day instead of like 12. And they had to give them time to rest. They had to get extra food and water. And they were given the less stressful tasks on the plantation. So if an overseer is mistreating a pregnant woman, the slave driver can go to the master and say, well, he did this, and then the overseer is going to get in trouble. Because I hate to refer to it like this, but it's how it is. It's like if a cow was going to have a calf. You don't overwork the cow. Please do not think I believe that, because I don't. It's just the best way to describe it. So far, is it what we've been told about how nightmarish it was to be a slave? So far, it sounds not too bad compared to being an immigrant worker. Now, the kind of work that slaves will do is mostly agricultural because they are concentrated in the South. And in the South is where they grow all this wonderful cotton. In the winter, they really didn't do a whole lot. They just tended to the animals, and this is when they would dry tobacco and just what normal farm people would do in the winter. They know how to work every part of the planting process. They've learned to do this. They make their own cider. They make their own. They help preserve foods. They store things. They just work like everybody else. The very old and the very young don't have to work. Okay, remember Mammy from Gone with the Wind? The rotund lady that was complaining about everybody being stupid. Well, see, in her job, all she did was basically bring food and tighten corsets. That was her job. 9 times out of 10, the mammy would be one of the older slave women who had a bunch of children and had been with the family for years and years and years. And at times, she was considered part of the family because she had probably served as nanny to the children, You know, maybe some even called her granny or something like that. So she may have even been a nursemaid or a wet nurse, I guess. Anybody know what that is?
I'm actually reading this book. It goes back and forth between like 1860s to the present, and like everything is like exactly the same as you've been like telling us. I can't believe it. It's really cool. I've never read a book like that. But it's this woman actually has to take her baby and leave her with a wet nurse because she can't do it.
What is a wet nurse though?
It's like a lady that takes care of the newborns and like breastfeeds them and takes care of them.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of times though that's not a good practice, because if you know anything, if you've ever had a kid, you know that your body produces what your child needs. And if another person is taking on the responsibility of nursing your child, then they're not getting everything they need. But still.
Well,
you
it was
know,
her sister's baby, and her sister died from childbed fever. Yeah, so she had to take it.
Yeah. But, yeah, they wet nursed. And it wasn't uncommon for, you know, the white babies of the master's wives to be wet nursed by one of the slaves that had just had a baby. Not uncommon. See how much they don't tell you in high school? Welcome to the truth. Okay, one of the very best ways that the slaves liked to work was under something called a task system. At the beginning of the day, they're given a task to complete. And once they're finished with that task, they're finished for the day. If that task takes them 5 hours, after 5 hours, they report to the overseer and say, I finished my task. They check out what they've done, and they can go home for the rest of the day. Go fishing if they want to. Things like that. They have the rest of the day. The slaves liked this. But a lot of times, it's not something you could finish in 5 hours. It was usually an all-day task, like repairing buildings or things like that, building new cabins. You have a gang system, and where you would take just a bunch of slaves, especially out to the fields, you know, and a bunch of people would work out in the fields at the same time. And this was by the master's schedule. He decided when this would happen. Usually it fell to the overseer, because a good overseer could run the plantation without the master being, you know, micromanaging everything. Now, they didn't just work in the fields. They did other things too. They fed and cared for the livestock. A lot of the male slaves and some of the female slaves actually served as what you would call a veterinarian. They would doctor the humans and they would doctor the animals with herbal medicines, things like that. It's not uncommon for the plantation owner's wife to be midwifed by one of the black slave women, because they had done it before. And, I mean, back then it wasn't kosher for a male doctor to be sticking his head under the covers. You just didn't want that. And you wanted a midwife because it was proper. They would build fences and repair things. They would maintain the appearance of the plantation. They would clean out ditches so that they wouldn't have flooding. They would go out and plow and clear new ground. Some of them were carpenters or blacksmiths or wheelwrights. What's a wheelwright? Anybody know? 2 points on Tuesday. What is a wheelwright? I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to look it up. You had people that their main job was just to take care of the horses in the stables. You had people that were just there to take care of the hogs or the pigs or the cows or the chickens or the ducks. A lot of these plantations raise ducks. Duck's really good if you've ever had it. I love it. I mean, they had, you know, people that, like, they were, I guess they'd be called, like, gamekeepers. They would keep, like, the birds and things like that. The women would be seamstresses, midwives, nurses, cooks, wet nurses, daycare providers, gardeners, household servants. Here's something I bet you didn't know. Plantation owners offered daycare for free. Are you surprised? What they would do is some of the older women who couldn't work anymore had a special cabin built where they would keep all the little kids under 3 years of age. And that was their job, was to take care of the babies. And at lunchtime between 11 and 2, the mothers would come in and nurse the babies, and they would change them and, do whatever and eat. It was up to the women in the daycare center to make sure the women ate and got enough fluids and were taken care of while they were nursing their babies. And they had daycare. And all the women had to worry about was their work. They didn't have to worry about who was taking care of their kids. Remember our problem over here being an immigrant? Child care provided. Now, house servants, of course, are going to have it a lot easier, and they will often get hand-me-down clothes from the family, especially the kids, like the little slave children. Most of the time, they ran around naked until they were about 2 or 3 years old. And they didn't have to start working until they were 5. The rest of the time, they just ran around and did whatever. What was happening to the 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds in the factories in the north? What were they doing? They were working. The slave children would play with the master's children. They would have big old time. Now, the master didn't just make his slaves work and not, let's put it this way, he didn't treat them as bad as we would think that he would. There were 2 main strategies that he will employ. First, he wants to show the slaves that he cares about them. You can't work for somebody you don't care about, or that doesn't care about you, that doesn't take care of you. If you don't feed a horse, what happens to the horse? It dies. If you don't feed your slave, can they work? No, they cannot work. So, number one, you want to treat them fairly. And a majority of the plantation owners will do this. Slave owners, plantation owners, whatever. They will do this. You treat somebody fairly, they work better. They provide decent food and housing. Let's talk about this. Tenement shanty towns and factory villages. If you live in a tenement or one of the mining towns, the factory villages or whatever, you have to pay rent? Yeah. In this case, the master provides the housing. You have a place to live. You might have to help build it, but you get to live there, and all you have to do is work. I mean, it's hard work, yeah, but is it any easier than what they're doing up north? It's a lot safer, isn't it? If you lose your hand here, are you out of a job? No, you'll get a job opening the front door as a butler or serving tea. If you do something to your leg and you walk with a limp, you might be trained as a carpenter or a blacksmith where you don't have to walk that much. So if you get hurt on the job here, you have something that they don't have up north. Plus, you have something like a retirement plan. lot of the times they will free the older slaves and keep them there and take care of them, so they can help train the new slaves. So just by what we're putting up there, which one's looking better? You still can't leave, but at least you can, get out and wander around with permission. They will try to keep families together. It wasn't uncommon for the families to be separated, but it wasn't as common as you think. And if the master was kind to his employees, they were loyal to him. When the Emancipation Proclamation, which by the way did not free anybody, was announced, the slaves would find out about it. A couple of them would jump off the property, hop back over, and go back to work. Their masters took care of them. So, I'm not saying slavery's right, but you've got to look at it this way. They're also going to provide incentives for the slaves. They let them have their own gardens, and they provide time for them to work in those gardens. They allow slaves to produce cotton and sell it so they can make money. They also encourage them to produce crafts and things like that. African crafts sold like crazy, especially the carvings. They have beautiful carvings. So they're encouraged to do this. They get rewards for faithful and superior service. If you work hard and if you don't cause trouble, you might get a $5 bonus at Christmas time. And you could buy your children a Christmas present. Things like that. They get medical care provided. They get cash prizes. They have contests to see who could pick the most cotton, who could cut the most tobacco, who could get the most rice, whatever like that. If they worked on Sunday, they got paid. Because it was a general rule, you don't work on Sunday. And a lot of the times they would bring preachers to the plantation and have church services with the slaves and the white families. Well, it doesn't sound too bad as a kid now, does it? I know what I'd rather do. There were, of course, punishments. It wasn't always the whip, even though I did write a really good paper about slave punishments when I went to college here. Got a name on it. Still have it. But they might be given extra work instead of like if they have a task system. When you finish your task, you have to do this in punishment for breaking curfew, something like that. If they had a special event planned, like a barbecue for the harvest or something, they would cancel that. They would put them in the stocks or give them solitary confinement, and they couldn't speak to anybody else, but they still took care of them. They fed them, gave them water, gave them a place to lay down while they were being confined. Does it say anything on there about they were whipped to death? Were they boiled in oil? Were they dumped in the river? No. It happened, but it's the exception and not the rule. The slaves had a decent diet. It wasn't great. Pork, a lot of pork. Usually each family was given a pig to raise every year. Corn, sweet potatoes. They could catch fish. They were given cornmeal, like 10 pounds a month. They had fruits, vegetables from their gardens, chickens. They made molasses, preserves. They were given flour, salt, things like that from the plantation owner. Every year they got 2 outfits of clothing, one for summer, one for winter. Men got a hat, and women got a kerchief for their head because it was illegal for a black woman to appear anywhere in public with her head uncovered, which is crazy. Well, I could see that could work out because you wouldn't have to worry about how your hair looked. They were given 1 pair of shoes. Little kids usually ran around naked or in flour sack dresses. And here's the funny thing. They weren't just flour sacks. They were usually made with really pretty patterns. And they would turn them into dresses. And my aunties had some of these when they were growing up. And she has a picture of her wearing one. It looks like material out of the store. They're really kind of neat. They got hand-me-downs from the white families, usually the domestic slaves, because they had to kind of look a little more presentable. They could buy things with the money they earned. So they could get permission to go to the local mercantile, if the plantation didn't already have one, and buy things. They had pretty good housing. They were usually small cabins with dirt floors. They could have had brick floors. They might have had plank floors. It just depended on where you were. That should be some had wooden floors. There were usually glass windows in there, brick hearths, brick fireplaces, things like that. Some of the cabins were made out of something called tabby. And these are the ones that are on the East Coast now that are still there after like 200 and some years. And they're made out of sand, oyster shells, and water. You could hit these things with a cannonball and it'd just leave a dent in it. There's one fort down in,
Pulaski, Savannah.
what is it?
Fort Pulaski in Savannah.
Is that it? The one where that's made out of the stuff? Yes.
Well, it's actually made out of brick that were the cannons from the north during the seizure of the South. Actually, they tore out the side of that. It's just a big hole.
Mhm.
Or like dent.
Wasn't there tabby behind it though? They covered the
Some of
tabby
the
with
buildings were
brick.
built with tabby.
Yeah, but they're still there, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, and they're great.
Exactly. So, see, they probably had, their houses were probably 10 times better than the village or the factory village houses that were up north.
They didn't burn out.
So, the master provides housing. They get cabins with fireplaces. I think that's a pretty good deal. And usually one family per home. So that looks pretty good to me, looks my opinion. So if you had one of these, you were be like building a beautiful adobe house today, I guess. Of course, they weren't exempt from disease. Africans are more susceptible to something called sickle cell anemia. And it is passed on by the male. And usually it lies dormant, but it will pop up. Slaves are more susceptible to respiratory because of the humidity, because it's so damp in the South. Overall, the masters are very concerned with the health of their slaves because this is their workforce. So you can't go around not feeding them, not giving them clothes, not letting them rest. You can't work them to death. But do they care about that up north? No, they don't. Marriage is typical. They're usually monogamous after marriage. There were plantations where they would breed slaves. I've read several instances about this. They had pretty large families because, that's what they were expected to do. And it's not uncommon for a woman to have 1 or 2 kids before she was even married, usually belonging to the master. And they even had ways of getting out of work. They would sabotage things. They would chop down the cotton plants so they wouldn't have to pick it later. They would burn buildings, ruin the equipment, like break their hose on purpose. They'd steal food. They'd run away. They would have rebellions. But again, the exception and not the rule. People won't work for you if you're treating them like crap. Simple as that. So, let's finish our little comparison. You have job security. Do you have money? Yeah, you do. You kind of have some money. You have money. And the master provides the food. Are you fined for everything as a slave? No, so you don't owe anybody any money. Your child care is provided. Women are given 1 month off after childbirth. And she stays in bed for 11 days after she gives birth. You want to know the story behind that? It's believed that on the 10th day after you deliver your child, that all of your internal organs move back into place. So they're not allowed out of bed except to go to the bathroom until the 11th day. But then you don't work for a whole month. When you do go back to work, they put you on light duty to make sure you can get in there and nurse your child. So now, let me ask you, which one would you rather be? Let's take a vote. How many of you would prefer to be an immigrant worker? How many of you would prefer to be a slave? Either way, it's both. It's a form of slavery. Except on one of them you get fed. Now do you see why I brought this up? I'm telling you what it was really like. Now let's talk about the union breaking up. That is up on BQL if you want to print that off. Okay. In Lawrence, Kansas, there was a little problem, something called flood Kansas. Have you ever heard that term before? Now,
was that when what's his face went and butchered all these slave owners?
something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I read like dude went to some guy's house, like chopped him and his like 3 kids up with like an axe or something.
That's exactly what happened. So basically, you remember we talked about popular sovereignty, in which the new state would decide its status as a free or a slave state. We talked about that. Now, Kansas does not want to come in as a slave state. They're fighting it tooth and nail. However, this is the minority. The majority are slave owners, and they want to come in as a slave state. So the U.S. District Court is wanting the state to come in as a free state to upset the balance in Congress. So they send in the federal marshals to hunt down these guys that are doing this. So the posse arrives outside Lawrence on May 20th, 1856, and most of the guys who were supposed to be arrested have already left. So it was a waste of time sending them there. So in the meantime, Sheriff Jones had been shot on another raid before that, so they decided that while they were there, they're going to have a few beverages and destroy the town. After he dismissed the posse, they all went out and they had a nice couple of rounds, you know. They got a little drunk and they turned into a drunken mob. Now, after Sheriff Jones was killed, they had to retaliate. So John Brown, who was famous for the attack on the ferry, Harper's Ferry, wasn't it? Harper's Ferry. He goes to this that creek there, Potawatomi Creek, and he breaks into this guy's house and marches him and 3 of his sons down the road and cuts them into little bitty pieces for retaliation. Only one of the children was spared, and the wife. That night, 2 more cabins were invaded. 2 more men are murdered. The ironic thing is that none of these men owned slaves. So they kind of messed up. So you have a whole lot of tension, and then finally it's going to erupt in the spring of 1861. Now, there are those that will say that the Civil War was a spur of the moment, boom, here's how it happened thing. It's not. It took a while to get there. You have a 6-year gap between the Compromise of 1850, which was proposed by who? Henry
Clay.
Clay, right. So he proposed that, which kept the southern states from seceding in 1850, and then in 1856, no, I'm sorry, in 1860, you have Bleeding Kansas. Oh, it's 1856. So there's a 6-year gap there. So the Civil War doesn't just happen in one day, it just happens gradually. Sort of like what the Nazis did during World War II, by taking, rights and privileges away from the Jews. This was 4 years before there were shots fired on Fort Sumter. So you've got a 10-year span there between 1850 and 1860 where nothing is really happening. So you still have the tensions getting stronger and stronger because more and more states are coming in, and then there's debate: is it going to come in free? Is it going to come in as a slave state? We have to keep the balance. We have to do this so everybody can be happy. Well, you can please some of the people some of the time, most of the people most of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. They should have read that somewhere and realized it. By 1850, you have the end of the Depression that hit in the 1840s, and once again prosperity will begin, especially in the South. Cotton is a big export. It was the #1 export from 1850 to 1861. You have better railroads, and now they are a big part of the U.S. economy. By 1850, you got more than 9,000 miles of track. In the North, why is it going to be different from the track in the South? We talked about this the other day. The gauge, right? Up north, it's a standard gauge. In the South, it's not. By 1860, there are about 30,000 miles of railroad track. Most of it up north. You have new railroads being built west of the Appalachian Mountains. With the railroads going further, you have more and more farmers that are able to get into the market system and therefore make some money. You have the railroad going into areas that were inaccessible before, and they will find like coal mines and iron mines and things like that. So the mining industry will take a big boom. Trade will be shifted. In 1840, most grain was shipped down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and those will come from the middle states, like Wisconsin, places like that. The steamboats are becoming obsolete. That way, that the railroad can move right in there. You can't store certain things in New Orleans because of the heat, and those will have to be stored in cooler areas, mostly up north. Wisconsin, the place of cheese. There you go. See? The big things were cheese, tallow, and lard. What's tallow? What do they use it for? It's a wax. So what do you think they use it for? Candles. Or if you don't have access to bees, then you make your candles out of tallow. And of course, lard was what they cooked with. The farmers began to move into Illinois and Iowa and start growing wheat and other grains there. The problem was that normal plows can't penetrate the prairie roots, which was a good thing. And we're going to find out in the 1930s that maybe John Deere should have just kept his little ideas to himself. But that's in history too. In 1837, he will invent a sharp-cutting steel plow to tame the grasses. It's strong enough to cut through the roots, the root system, so that they can plow up this land. Angus McCormick is going to come along and invent a mechanical reaper, which is sort of steam-operated. And they actually have a video of this. They recreated one and showed how it worked. and it can harvest 14 times more wheat than having a bunch of people doing it. Railroads were everywhere. Anybody ever heard that phrase, wrong side of the track? This is where it's going to come from. Instead of having the railroads run through the middle of town, they would be built on like the outskirts of town. And people that lived on the other side of the railroad tracks were people that couldn't afford to live on the other side. So they were looked down upon. So they were from the wrong side of the tracks. People don't like the noise and the dirt and the smoke and everything that the trains cause, but they realize that they're a necessity. They need them to work with the market system. So the tracks are moved to the outskirts of town. Industry up north is dependent on the immigrant workers. They're dependent on them, but they treat them like garbage. So, I mean, just think about it. By 1860, the birth rate in the U.S. has declined a little bit. People are deciding not to have as big of families. The immigrant will keep the labor field. Between 1820 and 1840, an estimated 700,000 people will enter the U.S. And these are just immigrants. By the 1850s, 2.6 million people are coming into the U.S. every year. A lot of these immigrants are strong. They're in the prime of their life. Why are they here? What are they after? The American dream, right? By 1856, 11,000 of the 224 that were coming over were under the age of 10, and 20,000 of 224,000 were over the age of 40. So you've got people between the ages of 15 and 39. They can work. They can have families. They came from the U.S. for all different kinds of reasons. In Ireland, you have more and more immigrants coming here because of the potato famine. For some reason, somebody decided potato would be the best food for them to have, and one year a big old blot hits it, and there ain't no taters to eat. So they come to the U.S. That's why you have a spike in immigrants from Ireland. You have Germans and Scandinavians coming over for economic reasons. And you can just read about those. They basically were fleeing political and social oppression. The factories are going to become dependent on immigrants for labor, even the immigrant children. They would work for lower wages. They wouldn't protest to working in harsh conditions, but they needed their jobs. The populations grew faster. A lot of these people were Catholic. Did they believe in any kind of birth control? No, they didn't. So they not pop out a kid every year. And it's funny how I'll put that. The immigrants lived in tenements, cellars, shacks. Isn't that what we talked about earlier? You have what are called slums. There's a lot of crime. There's a lot of drinking. There is a theory now that Jack the Ripper left England and came to New York and started killing prostitutes over here. They think they've uncovered at least 5 crimes that they can link back to Jack the Ripper. Interesting, huh? And it's the same method of killing, and it happened as soon as the killing stopped in England, it started in New York.
They never found out who he was.
I know. Never did. They think he might have been this mortician guy, but they're not sure. There are so many theories out there. Americans don't like immigrants because they drive down wages. Who's going to pay an American more money to work doing something that an immigrant will do for half price? So Don't we have that sort of problem right now? Isn't that sort of a big old issue going on where they've got guys at the border with machine guns? Yeah, this is a problem. Americans are afraid that immigrants won't be able to learn our language and our customs. Heaven forbid they have some individuality about them and celebrate their own culture. I'm German. My family still does things like the first Germans that came over. The men eat first. The women wait on them, even though I'm changing that a little bit. But you have a certain way to do things. And they think just because that they came here, they had to give all that up. Now, I'm all for, if you're going to live in a country, you know the language, you know the customs. But don't let go of your own. And this is what they wanted them to do. Especially with the Native Americans when they put them in the boarding schools and things. Of course, the South has some complaints. Southern planters will prosper. I'm going to block her. So as the planters prosper, the northern factories are going to buy the cotton. So it's a symbiotic relationship. Where's she? The problem is that while technology is moving forward in the north, in the south it's staying where it was. They're not concerned about technology. Yes, they have the cotton gin. Yes, they have the plows. Yes, they have the harvesters. Things like that. But they're not trying to keep up. Instead of buying machinery to help out, they're buying more slaves and more land. The Southern nationalists are going to start pushing for the idea that the South needs to be its own nation. Again, is that a new concept at this point? What do you think happened in 1850? Same concept. They want more industrialization so that we can be agricultural and industrial and not have to depend on the North. Because do we depend on the North to buy our cotton? Yeah, we do. If we can mill our own cotton, do we need them? No, we don't. They also complain that the North will use the power of the banks and their commerce system to make us a colony. Is there some validity to this argument? Yeah. What happens to the cotton we send up there for them to mill? Who do they send it back to sell it to? Us, at a raised price. So, are we technically kind of like a colony? Economically? Yeah, we are. We don't want any kind of federal aid for economic development because we're afraid that if they can dabble in our economic situation, what are they going to go after next? Who works the plantations? Right. They're going to try to get our slaves away from us. By not accepting any kind of help or refusing to industrialize, this is going to weaken the South politically and commercially and economically. In 1853, Franklin Pierce becomes president. He is a direct ancestor of George W. Bush through his mother, Barbara. Scary thought. Franklin Pierce was a horrible president, too. So he was 48 years old when he was elected, and the youngest man to be elected at that time. How old was Barack when he was elected? Anybody know? He's in his 40s, I think. He's not much older than me. He wants to spread democracy all around the world. Again, not a new idea. And he believed that arguing about slavery would stop development of new resources. Think he's pro-slavery or anti-slavery? He's pro-slavery. In 1853, you have something called the Gadsden Purchase, or the Gadsden Purchase, and they will purchase about 45,000 acres of desert so they can build a transcontinental railroad. Now the trouble starts. Stephen Douglas has this idea, and Stephen Douglas was about this tall. He was the very first Munchkin. He wants to organize the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, keep the ban on slavery below the Missouri Compromise line, which was what number? You remember? 3630. So in January of 1854, he reintroduces this idea, but says we shouldn't prohibit slavery in these new areas, and he does this to get the support of the South. Think it'll work? Think the South wants to expand and be able to take their slaves with them? Yeah, they do. The bill will create Kansas and Nebraska, and we already know that there's a bunch of hubbub going on in Kansas with all this stuff. The Missouri Compromise is basically thrown to the side, and popular sovereignty is going to have to decide whether or not it's going to be a slave state or a free state. Now, the idea is that Kansas would be slave and Nebraska would be free. But there's a big old mess that happens over this. The Northerners do not like the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They hate it. They protest it vigorously. The Democrats and the Whigs and the Free Soilers think that the act gave slave owners too much power and doesn't deal with the morality or the evilness of slavery. Do they have a point? I mean, yeah, slavery's wrong. But doesn't the South treat their slaves better than they do their workers up north? Uh-huh. So they, it's like the pot calling the kettle black. Don't even go there. And then you get a group of people called the Know-Nothings. Who's that? Hogan's Heroes. Schultz. I know nothing. They're a secret nativist organization. They call themselves the Know-Nothings because they're told that if anybody asks them anything, they say, I know nothing. They think that Americans should rule America. What a concept. Can you imagine? They're clearly anti-immigrant. They're anti-Catholic. They want to make it the period of naturalization longer for people to become citizens. Now it's 7 years? They wanted to push it up to like 14 years. They want to purge the government of corrupt politicians. You just have to start all over again. They're all corrupt. I mean, that wouldn't work. I mean, get rid of some of them. They want to get rid of the politicians who prey on foreigners and Catholics to get elected to office. And they think that they're the most corrupt. The Republicans are... This is still not the same Republican Party that Abraham Lincoln belongs to. The Republicans back then were considered to be too radical, and they didn't think that the party would last very long. But the Kansas problem will turn out to be the best thing that could happen to the Republican Party. So you have a debate going on of whether Kansas is going to come in as free or slave. And pro-slavery people see everybody as a threat, so they had a little case of paranoid schizophrenia. They don't trust anybody. In 1854 and 55, you have elections in Kansas to determine whether it's going to be a free or a slave state. People from Missouri will take control of the polls illegally and stuff the ballot boxes. This is not good. The congressional committee that's appointed to investigate this figure out that 60% of the votes that are cast are illegal because they are cast by people from Missouri. So the pro-slavery forces will get power in Kansas, so it ends up coming in as a slave state, and they will use legal codes to keep anti-slavery people out of there. So the code will limit free speech, impartial juries, and fair elections. My favorite story, then I'll let you go. And we'll finish the rest of it. That's good. Now, Charles Sumner gave a speech in Congress a few days before all this stuff is going on in Kansas. And it's called The Crime Against Kansas, and he condemns slavery. In his speech, apparently, he insults a Carolina congressman, and another senator heard about this, and his name was Preston Brooks, and he felt insult for this man because he wasn't there to defend himself. So on May 2nd, 1856, after the Senate had adjourned, he approaches, and isn't it Brooks, he approaches Sumner, and without saying a word, he goes up to this man with this big old heavy wooden cane and starts whacking him over top of the head with it and beating him mercilessly. I mean, not tap tap, I mean like wham wham. And I mean, these people are just sitting there going, what in the world's going on? And he about beats this guy to death. He beats him unconscious. He's unconscious for like a week. I mean, his head's all bloody, he's got broken bones, and people are just standing there not knowing what to do. This is not uncommon. There were fist fights on the floor of Congress all through the 1850s and 60s. This is not an unusual occurrence, but it's particularly brutal. But he beats this guy to the pulp for insulting his relative. Of course, in the North, everybody's like, oh my gosh, this, backwards hillbilly from the South beat our beloved, whatever he was, over the head. I think he was a representative or a senator, I don't know. The South looks at Brooks and says, woohoo! Why don't we all pick up a cane and just go in there and beat the heck out of these people and knock some sense into them? I mean, supposedly you can still see some of the blood on the floor. They preserved that part of the floor where it happened. I haven't seen it, but I'm going to. The caning incidents will give the Republican Party the push that it's going to need to elect who in 1860? Lincoln. Right. We will pick this up on Thursday. We'll get through this. We'll get through the Civil War. Then on Tuesday. Today's what? Thursday? Yep. We'll pick this up on Tuesday, finish up, and on Thursday we'll review the whole thing.